Okay, so we're back with the model of the macroeconomic equilibrium in the classical view, and here I've drawn an aggregate demand curve that has been shifted to the right of the original aggregate demand curve. Any number of reasons the aggregate demand curve could have shifted to the right. Maybe increases in minimum wage required by law. People got paid more, therefore consumption spending went up. Perhaps it's a government stimulus. Maybe interest rates have dropped and therefore investment spending has gone up. Maybe currency exchange rates have changed in a favorable manner so that net exports have increased. Whatever the reason, what we see in the classical view is that in the short run we have an increase in output, GDP 1, to match up with aggregate demand 1. We also have an increase in the price level. Average price level goes up from the original price level here to this price level here. So we're going to go ahead and draw the original price level too. So we have an increase in output and also an increase in prices. And this is familiar to us because this is very much like what would happen in any market. Now we're just looking at the economy as a whole. But here's what's interesting is the classical economist believes that in this moment here, we're operating beyond potential output. So this moment corresponds to this, whereas this corresponds to that. I should probably erase this to make it a little bit clearer. And when we are operating beyond potential, it means that we're introducing excessive demand for resources. Picture right out here that as suppliers are expanding output to gain profits from the increase in average price level, they're going to hire more workers. And when they go into the labor market and start demanding more workers, they're going to push the price of labor up. And if you continue to push the price of labor up and the price of rent and the price of capital, you are going to find that the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift. Remember that factor prices are a determinant of short-run aggregate supply. If the factor prices go up, suppliers are going to expect a higher price at every quantity, or they're going to produce less at every price. That's two ways of saying the same thing. What we find is that eventually short-run aggregate supply will shift back to producing an equilibrium right on the long-run aggregate supply curve. What has happened here? Well, again, remember, from here to here, prices have gone up because of an increase in aggregate demand. So from point 1 to point 2, prices have gone up because of an increase in aggregate demand. But the increasing prices also create increasing prices in factor markets. Factors of production are a determinant of short-run aggregate supply. So as those prices increase, we'll see that short-run aggregate supply will shift back to the left, eventually returning to equilibrium on the long-run aggregate supply curve. So a classical economist believes that you're either on the long-run aggregate supply curve or you're on your way back to the long-run aggregate supply curve. The economy might come out of equilibrium at any moment, but it's always going to return to long-run aggregate supply. This particular example is called an inflationary gap. And we call it an inflationary gap because it's a gap in GDP production that is going to create inflation. The net result of this increase in aggregate demand is not an increase in output. It's a temporary increase in output, but the output will then decrease back to GDP potential with a net increase in prices. Aggregate demand increases here have only driven up prices. So in the long run, you cannot get growth in an economy by managing aggregate demand. You can, if you're a classical thinker, because if you do shift aggregate demand, all you're going to do is end up driving up prices and returning output to the original level of potential. That's why we call classical economists supply-siders, because they believe that growth, long-term growth in the economy only comes from doing those things which would get at long-run aggregate supply to shift to the right. In other words, they think that long-run growth is only going to come from shifting the production possibilities curve outward. So things like investment in technology or investment in education or cutting business taxes, those sorts of things that would trigger businesses to invest in their ability to produce. Remember that to shift the production possibilities curve, you need more resources or better quality resources. So anything that you would do to shift the PPC out to the right will also shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. You cannot get growth from managing demand.